say welcome everyone to the this iteration of the Search Mastery speaker series. We have these several times a semester, and sponsored by the Search Mastery Interest Group, where we explore the foundations and practice of search skills, education, and literacy, and sometimes a bigger picture of information literacy as well. And today, we're really happy to have Daniel Trielli talking with us. Daniel's the Assistant Professor of Media and Democracy at the Merrill College of Journalism. And just to tell you a little bit about Daniel, he's Assistant Professor of Media and Democracy. He joined the Merrill College of Journalism's faculty in fall of 2023 as Assistant Professor of Media and Democracy. Daniel earned his master's degree at Merrill College in 2016, and previously was the Assistant Professor of Journalism at Loyola University, Chicago, starting in 2022. That year, he completed his PhD at Northwestern University as well. He researches the impact of algorithmic curation on journalism and political information, and studies how Google affects the news and the audiences that use it to search. He's interested in data and computational journalism, media literacy, and algorithmic accountability. Daniel came to Merrill as a master's student in 2015 after a 10-year career as a journalist in Brazil at the national and regional newspapers. While at Merrill, he was a graduate assistant and reported for Capital News Service. He led the CNS data team that helped win a Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award in 2018 for Homesick, a report on income disparities and their effect on asthma rates in Baltimore. I have some information about Daniel's research here and where it's been published. It's also in the bio. It's also in the bio from the talk. But if you want to follow up on this, but he's been published in Information Communication and Society and the Journal of the International Symposium on Online Journalism, and is presented at multiple conferences. And he also occasionally writes about his interests and research in public-facing media, both in the U.S. and Brazil. So we're really excited to have you, Daniel. Thank you so much for talking to us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Mary Ann. I'm going to try to share my screen now, my slides. Let me just take a look. Which one of this is? Okay, this is it. Oh, thank God I don't have a PhD in media technology and society. Otherwise, I would be really embarrassed by this. Well, thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm very happy to talk to you today. As Marianne said, I'm going to give you the perspective of someone from journalism and from communication studies into search engines. And hopefully this is going to be a little bit illuminating, not necessarily on the technical aspects of search engines that I think this audience is very well aware of, but more on the perspectives that we in the journalism, on what are the things that we in journalism care about in this interaction between news and search engines, right? So a little bit of context and a little bit of a shameless plug. I'm going to be talking about some concepts and ideas that are present in a class that I'm teaching right now here in the spring, and I'm going to teach it again in the fall. This class is called Machine Editors, which is about the impact of search engines, social media, and AI in the news media, particularly the production of news media, but we also get into how people consume news content as well. It's been a pleasure teaching this class because not only have journalism students joined our course, but also folks from the English and American Studies department. So I'm always glad to be able to talk to an audience of diverse fields because we can all bring in our different perspectives, right? So I start both that class, and I'm going to start this talk as well, getting our bearings a little bit straight for a moment, in the sense that let's define a little bit about what is journalism. This is something that we actually do even for journalism students in my class, because I tell them that this class is kind of like a psychoanalysis of the relationship between news media and these digital platforms, right? We have to really dig deep to see, to get very fresh in our minds what journalism does, how is it supported, and how those things relate to digital platforms such as search engines. So journalism is a practice that relies on things like accuracy, objectivity, and fairness. And it's bound by a set of standards and a set of ethics with the goal of creating news content, which means transforming newsworthy events that are happening in the world into text, video, and audio and visuals to inform the public, right? Now, that journalism practice is supported by a journalism industry in which news organizations, in whatever economic or social context that they are, supply the means to conduct that journalism practice, right? And in turn, audiences, particularly in the United States, but other free market countries, support that industry through ads and subscriptions, right? They support this industry by consuming it, by adding to the numbers of reach of those news organizations. And that could be translated into direct payments like subscriptions or even direct buys. You buy a newspaper, you pay to see a story, or indirectly by being, recipients of that information and being tallied up into metrics that are then used to pitch that news organization to ad buyers, right? Now, a lot of the values and practices from journalism, those sets of ethics, those standards, come from the 20th century. Doesn't mean that they're not updated in the 21st century, but they started being developed, and the majority of those ethics and standards and practices are still the same as in the 20th century. And a lot of theories that we use to understand news media and the consumption of news media also comes from that period. This is a great illustration from a book about the American newsroom in the mid-20th century. And this is basically even today, the mental model of a lot of people about what a newsroom looks like, right? It's a big room with a bunch of reporters, some special offices around it, specialized sessions in a paper, there's a management, there's maybe a dark room to develop the photos, there's a wall of teletypes to get outside information before the internet, obviously. There's a copy desk, which is like the central hub for all this information flowing through the newsroom, right? So this is what a 20th century newsroom looked like, and a lot of our mental model to it, even to this day. The way that this newsroom pumped out information to the news audience is that it relied on direct contact with that audience through its distribution channels, right? It had access to newsstands, delivery trucks to send out those newspapers, those magazines directly to the homes of the consumers, and airwaves, right? And in all ways, even though there was some intermediaries there were never any intermediaries that really dedicated themselves into editing what was in the story or selecting which one of these papers is better than the other one, right? It was all commercial. It was, can you afford to have access to the infrastructure? If you can, great, like you can reach your audience, right? Now, what does all that have to do with search, right? Well, we know that the way that we consume news now has drastically changed. Some of us still subscribe to news organizations, not newspapers, but their websites. And we still watch network or cable TV. But digital platforms as a whole have become increasingly important for both intentional and incidental exposure to news, both for people who follow the news and search for news, but also people who are just on social media platforms or search engines looking for other types of everyday information and casually come across news items. And both these revert into traffic for the news websites. And traffic reverts to ad money, and ad money is, of course, what supports news organizations, right? Pew has these surveys to try to detect how people get their news in the United States. Digital devices is the biggest means nowadays, surpassing even television and eclipsing radio and print in the way that people get their news. And within digital devices, search is a significant intermediary of news. Like, we talk a lot about the role of social media has, the news and the public debate, and that's definitely important. But more Americans say that they sometimes or often go to search to get their news than social media, right? And so I think we don't talk we don't talk enough about search in the news, proportionate to what we should be talking about compared to the behavior of Americans in the way that they get their news, right? Now, as I said, there was this old schema of how news distribution was put forth, right? And this flip to digital platforms have increased dramatically their role as intermediaries of news, right? And of course, digital platforms don't do this for free. They reap benefits from that, but they also make it that news media has to adapt to these new channels of information, right? Now, the newspaper industry kind of tried to adapt to the digital publishing world. We see that they created their websites, they kind of reverted to digital advertising, and we see that the share of digital advertising has increased over the years. However, when we take a look at the bigger picture, the math still doesn't favor news organizations or the newspaper industry, right? Because the growth of digital revenue from ads is still not enough to cover the loss of the print advertising money that they had. We had a peak of advertising money in the early 2000s, and that has come crashing down with the rise of digital publishing. Even circulation money, which is subscriptions plus individual buys, is not enough to cover whatever the decrease of advertising was. So what we see is that the online publishing has been incredibly disruptive to the newspaper industry, because even though it tried to adapt to this publishing mode, it's not enough to cover whatever the peak was in the print version of this. And in that scenario, a lot of research has been done in the journalism field about the intersection between digital platforms and journalism. And I'm going to give you some examples of my own research in this area, right? So in particular, we can think about these three different layers of this relationship, right? The three different agents in this relationship. First is how the news media is adapting. How can news media survive in these times? Second is the digital platforms themselves, right? What are their biases? What do they select? What do they select to show the audience? And again, a lot of this research has been focused on social media, right? Like what goes viral, what people share, etc. But I think some more dedicated view for search is important, and we should do more of it. And finally, what is the perspective of the audience? How are they informed? What do they select? And why do they select the things that they do? What is their connection with digital platforms, right? What do they click on and things like that? So first, I'm going to be talking about some research that I've done in this first, in this middle intermediary layer, which is the digital platforms, right? What do they select? What are their biases? What are their preferences when it comes to news sources? Now, a few years ago, I did a study about the top stories box, which is that little widget that shows up on Google that shows you the news of the day, right? You search a topic, for instance, Venezuela, which is the example here that I have on the slide, and you see like these news items of the day. about Venezuela, right? So the question we had in this study was, what does Google select in terms of sources to be featured in those top stories? Do they pick the New York Times? Do they pick, an English language Venezuelan news organization in this case? How distributed is that attention that goes to those sources? Because what we know is being featured in those info boxes, in those little widgets that Google provides, is a boon for the traffic in your website, right? They have a highly visible location and search results, and that can direct a lot of traffic and generate a lot of money for news organizations. So we're interested in, through this bigger question, which is, how does the dominant search engine in the world shapes attention to news information? What editorial values are driving this selection? And does Google provide diversity in its curation? And we did a bunch of analysis, using search terms that were about the trending topics of the day in terms of news. And we scraped those results of those top stories, those top stories box, and it's extracted the sources of them. And we found that Google uses hundreds of sources, but we are also doing that every minute to see how often do each sources show up. So our analysis has shown that if you take all the sources and all the times that they appear, 20% of the sources represent 86% of the impressions. Meaning, although Google can use hundreds of sources for that top stories box, the top 1/5 of it, it's going to get the more attention than anything else in that long tail. And in fact, only 3 sources, CNN, New York Times, and the Washington Post, represented 23% of all the impressions. So we see a very skewed distribution towards a handful of source websites, which demonstrate this lack of source diversity on this specific tool on Google. This leads to what we think is an unequal capture of the economic benefits of being featured on Google, is particularly in this very visible widget, right? So as like more referrals mean more traffic, and more traffic means more money. As Google selects this handful of sources to be featured more often in this very prominent source, we can see that they basically get all the advantages of being Google, and these are not small sources to begin with. They are very news sources that are very well structured, right? Now, the other avenue of research that is very common in this field is research how news audiences get informed, right? Why do they select what they do? And how do they make their choices on how to get informed? Now, to this extent, there has been a lot of previous research in terms of things like selective exposure, which is a 20th century theory that basically predicts that people are going to select media according to their viewpoints, right? We're not going to read, if you're a liberal, you're going to buy the liberal newspaper. If you're a conservative, you're going to watch the conservative news channel, right? What we're interested in is, how does that play out in a thing like a search engine, in which you choose your sources by clicking on stuff, but you also kind of start selecting what you want to see by the search term you use itself. And even sometimes you can kind of show who you are by using certain search terms. That's the idea, right? And we have seen some studies that see search queries as an expression of preferences, right? Searching itself being imbued with the bias of the searchers, previously held beliefs being important in determining how people search and things like that. So thinking about that literature, we had this mental model of liberals and conservatives maybe searching for stuff using different terms, right? And this is what this illustration shows. Maybe there's an overlap in how people search about the same topic, but maybe by virtue of your political identity, you kind of frame things into different ways, right? Particularly when we're looking for information about political things. So our question is, are those differences in the way that people can search? How is the search engine response to those, right? Are they going to show a more similar results than the overlap of queries, or are they going to show dissimilar results, putting people in what we call echo chambers or filter bubbles, right? So that's what we wanted to measure with this study called Partisan Search, in which we first asked, do people from different ideological identities, look for information in different ways? And we did this survey in the 2018 midterm elections in California, Texas, and Ohio, asking about the Senate candidates. So the question that we used for that survey was, one of the candidates in this year's Senate race is in your state, in this case, example is Texas, and one of the candidates, either the Republican or the Democrat, in this case, Ted Cruz, if you were to search for information about that candidate, what search terms would you use, right? And we asked the participants to give us 5 search terms. So we had 12 groups of queries from liberals, and we asked them, their political identification. So we had it for liberals and conservatives, about the Democratic candidate and about the Republican candidate in 3 states. And that led us to a bunch of unique search queries. And then we kind of thematically coded those queries into, are these queries just about who is blah, blah, blah? Or is it about information about the election itself? When is the vote, or something like that? Or maybe something a little bit more informative, like background of the candidate, or political issues, political positions of that candidate. Or maybe it's about past controversies of that candidate, right? And doing that thematic coding, we can kind of determine whether or not those interests were different from each group. And we found that liberals and conservatives can, in some cases, have distinct ways of, or distinct interests in what they're searching, right? So in this case, liberals and conservatives search for different things when looking for the Democratic candidate in California and both candidates in Texas, but there was no statistical difference between what they were looking for about the Republican candidate in California and the Ohio candidates in both parties. And we think that this is probably the case because the candidates in which there was some statistical differences between liberals and conservatives, they were long-standing politicians. They had long careers. People knew about them, so therefore people knew about controversies about them and knew about things that they might either favor or disfavor about those candidates, right? And then the second question was, are those searches distinct enough to produce differences in Google search? Like doing, like is Google gonna give you the same results or different results? And we tested it out by doing automated searches using the search terms that were generated by the surveys. We had tagged them as liberal search terms or conservative search terms, and we analyzed the overlap of those results across different groups. And what we found is that although even in groups where there were distinctive searches, statistically different searches, Google basically gave everyone a very good overlap of results, meaning Google kind of mainstreamed the narrative about these candidates most of the time, right? So the whole thing about these differences in search queries leading people into different buckets of information, that really didn't pan out. What panned out was there is a corpus of mainstream search results that Google serves to everyone, regardless of what the appendage of that query is about a candidate. If you want to search like Ted Cruz great guy or Ted Cruz corrupt politician is going to lead you to results about Ted Cruz regardless. And what we think is that Google, because it selects from authoritative, high value sources, that there might be, it might be selecting only those sources to be the main corpus of potential results for these candidates. So by doing that selection on those top sources, it's automatically creating a mainstream version of results, right? And this is significant for news because now it points to a direction in which news organizations have to hit that benchmark of a high quality results. It's not just about the topics or matching exactly the queries that people have. It's about having a high enough score as a source from Google to be listed in that top, right? The third thing that we can look at that I'm going to talk about in the next study and the studies that I've been conducting currently is about the news media itself. How do the news media adapt to this new world? How can they survive, by switching from the old newspaper logic to the new, digital platform intermediated logic? And again, the illustration of the old American newsroom, and I completely botched it by doing my own additions into what a 21st century newsroom might look like. We see that the copy editor is gone because all the reporters are expected to be their own copy editors. Newspapers are not going to pay for a reporter to have their work checked and improved in terms of writing by another person. And in fact, that person was probably replaced by new roles in a newsroom, such as an engagement editor that keeps checking how our stories are doing in the digital marketplace, right? Are people talking about it? Are people talking about it in ways that we can qualitatively improve our story or create new stories in tomorrow and the day after, right? We might have a new data team or an AI team nowadays that kind of develops new tools, new ways of doing journalism. We might replace those teletypes on that wall for a big dashboard of audience, and engagement scores, right? Like seeing what are the topics that people are talking about, what are the most successful stories on our website right now, and things like that. And we also can, open room for potential new avenues of funding, of making money, like developing products based on the content that we have. Maybe we published a big story, a big service-oriented stories. Can we turn that into an app and put it in an app store and sell ads in that app, or even sell that app, right? A lot of investigative long-form journalism organizations develop, partnerships to transform their investigations into documentaries, right, for Netflix or something like that. So in this highly engaged with the digital world newsroom, you have a more variation of roles that goes beyond just the news making itself, right? And we have an adaptation from the reporters themselves, because now they not only have to have the attention of the readers in that competition in the newsstand, but they also have to have the attention of the digital platform algorithms, right? They are being instantiated to start writing in a way that the algorithm can pick it up. And this is kind of fits under the umbrella of search engine optimization. Well, is your headline good enough? Is it optimized for search engines, right? So I did an interview study that is under review right now, the publication of it for a journal, that basically asks, how do journalists deal with what I've been calling this new external algorithmic editor? This algorithm, and on Google particularly for this study, that indirectly has been guiding journalists how to do their work in a way that fits the algorithm a little bit better, right? Like, how do they deal with pressures of SEO and the pressures of having to have a bigger reach, which was something that in the olden days, journalists, it wasn't their problem, right? So I interviewed a bunch of US journalists, and what I found out is that they do three things in the face of this new algorithmic editor. The first instinct is to resist, right? Resist giving up on their editorial values. They set particular limits around how they frame their stories and how they select the topics that they cover, right? Like they say, no, I have to do this story, even though it's not going to be picked up by the search engine because this is an important story. Or no, I'm not going to frame this as a controversy, even though I know that it would go viral or it would be picked up by Google more, because that's not what the story is, right? Now, the second thing that they do is that they relinquish some editorial control in some types of content, right? In which they can even call that content search work. And what do they mean by search work? Is that, okay, 4 days out of the week, they cover their council meetings, they cover like the school board meetings, they do the regular journalistic work that might seem harder to sell in an environment of high competition for attention of the readers, right? But once a week, they are okay with doing one story that they know the search engine is going to love, right? Like they're going to do once a week, they're going to do a story about like the top 10 burgers in Montgomery County, right? And it's going to be a list, and it's going to pick up all that wonderful traffic of people looking for stuff to eat in Montgomery County, right? They call this type of work search work, and they separate it from their everyday work in journalism, right? And finally, and I think this is the most interesting thing that they do, is that they renegotiate their old 20th century values in journalism to fit this new logic of search engines and digital platforms. And they frame what they do in a way that fits both things together. For instance, they can say, well, originally I wasn't going to do this catchy headline or this very descriptive headline of what's happening using all the entity names that are in the story, because that's like a boring title. But if I do that, I know that the search engine is going to pick it up, and everyone looking for our county is going to see the story. And therefore, it is the best thing to do, not journalistically, traditionally, but for the purposes of reaching more people through the search engine. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do that not because it goes counter my values, but because if I really think about it, the more people I reach, the more impact my story has. And impact is a news value, right? Like I have to have impact. So journalists often can renegotiate what they do for the platform as a value for the work that they do in journalism. And when they do that, they tend to be happier, right? Now, I'm doing some research right now that is also about the survival of local news and the adaptation of local news, of news in particular, but this is about local news. And here I have to thank the Scripps Howard Foundation, because they provided a very generous grant for us at Merrill. And this grant is going to fund a few initiatives. 3 of them are the development of actual AI tools to support local journalism, right? We have the Beat Book, the AI Reporter's Toolbox, and the AI Meeting Watchdog, which are AI-powered tools that we are going to develop and give to the local news of Maryland so that they can do their jobs better of covering their jurisdictions, right? But then sneaked under there and as a 4th project in this by the connection of the fact that these digital platforms are AI, are supported by AI, and they are AI platforms. We are looking into how visible local news in Maryland is in those digital platforms. And specifically, we want to help local news to become more visible, right? So remember when I said that there was this big bucket of high quality sources that Google tends to pick up? We want to make sure local news is at that bucket, right? Because we know that search engines and digital platforms as a whole look for significant markers of quality, relevance, and authoritativeness to give a source more visibility. And these markers are search engine optimization, which includes both the way that a web page is set up, but also what headline articles have and things of that nature. We know that they look at whether or not the page has multimedia content. Does it have photos? Does it have video, right? We know that they want updated websites, right? We know that from previous research, having a Wikipedia page greatly favors a news organization in the way that they're present, because if then you look for the news organization, a little info box pops up about them, right? Which improves their credence by the user. And also social media profiles tend to help out in that visibility. Now, the problem with that is that all of those things require time, effort, and resources, which are things that local news organizations don't have, right? So with that in mind, the questions that we have is, how do local news organizations in Maryland positions themselves on digital platforms? Meaning, what do they do online with their websites, with social media, with Wikipedia that makes them more visible, right? And on the other hand, how often do local news organizations appear on Google search results when we're looking for local news topics? And what factors could actually increase that higher digital visibility, right? So we collected two modes of data for this project. First is what we call digital positioning data, which is, what do local news do, right? How often do they update the website? How often do they update their social media profiles, et cetera? And the second is the digital prominence data, which is how often local news organizations are listed as sources of news on Google. And we're going to expand that to social media in the future, right? But the real interesting part is those correlations, right? The correlation between digital positioning and digital prominence data. Now, here are some questions that we ask about the digital positioning data. Do they have a website? Is it updated every day or at least every week? Same thing for Facebook and X. And here are the search terms that we've used to try to detect how often do these local news organizations show up as sources for local news. Just the county name in Maryland plus local news or politics or traffic or crime. And here, sorry, the connection that we found between those things. We comparing the positioning score, which is basically adding up all the things that a local news organization can do, updating their website, plus having a social media page, plus updating that social media page, et cetera. We can get to a high score of 12, right? So we have news organizations that only have one of those things, and we have local news organizations that do all 12 of those things. And we compare that with how many times those news organizations show up on Google. And we saw this correlation, this significant correlation that the more things that local news organizations do to show up, to be present digitally, the more they show up on Google. So right now, we are thinking about those news organizations at the bottom of the screen and how to improve their standing. So we want to see what are the things that can make the most difference. Is it one social media platform? Is it the other? Is it updating every day or is updating every week? Right? So this analysis is still ongoing, but I've presented it on a conference, on the AAGMC Midwinter Conference last week, and we're going to hopefully finish that analysis to present in conferences still this year. What's next? Looking ahead in the future, things that we might be interested in the journalism field. Well, just like everyone, AI developments, right? How does the interest of AI into this relationship is going to shift things around? And I'm thinking in two different ways. First, AI snippets replacing search results. We saw this story last year at the New York Times, how when Google introduced those snippets as in the top of the results, above the organic search results and above even the top news stories about that topic, that made news publishers skittish and afraid, because now the users have less of a reason to click through the results and actually go into the news websites. And therefore, that money that was generated by that traffic is going to stay in the search engine results page, right? And the other side of this is generative AI itself, the tools of generative AI being used as search engines, right? People talking to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever tool and asking about the topics of the day and not even going to Google to get that information, right? The problem with that is not only that, as we as a society have often discussed, the information that these tools provide can be mistaken, but even if they are correct, they often do not link to the sources of their information or even cite them. So all the work that news organizations have put in putting this correct information into the world is not going to be linked to that news organization at all, which is going to have even more significant impacts into the money or even the brand of these news organizations. So those are concerning things that warrant more research. So looking ahead, things to consider for the near future. What do we want from the relationship between search and news? What are our values and expectations out of that? Do we want search to support news somehow? Do we want news to be supported by our attention as reflected by ads or subscription? Do we even want that relationship to be the end all be all of monetary support, right? As digital platforms change, how does the way that people get their news information also change? This is a forever question, right? And how does journalism adapt to those changes? I am, as Marianne said, a journalist by training and trade. I'm in it to help journalism because I believe in it. Not necessarily, we are going to be able to help the journalism industry as it is right now, but we definitely should help journalism practice. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and questions about those topics, and how can we make our information ecosystem better, whatever that might be. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you. That was amazing, Daniel. It's so informative and thought-provoking. And I will let everybody know that the chat is available for your questions and comments. And while we're waiting for some of those to come in, I took a couple notes, so I will just I'll ask a couple. I'll ask. I think I have two main questions that occurred to me. One is that I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on this idea of engagement and whether news organizations are creating engagement and how that compares to responding to engagement, and whether what should they be creating the engagement. I'm not sure which side of it is or maybe it's both sides that they should be be working on. But it seems like, you know, if you're creating your stories in response to what gets engaged, then you start to limit the amount of information and stories that you're covering. So that's one thought that I'll put out there. And then the other one is whether there's a way to incentivize, whatever that word is, the search engines to help with this local news problem, and whether there are features that they could add that might be beneficial to everybody. So those are my two thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for that. Very, very important thoughts, right? First, on the question of engagement. And I say this as I look through the guest list. I know that one of our other faculty who is an expert in engagement is watching, Stacy Decker. So I'm kind of sweating on a bit because I'm not the expert in engagement, she is. But I think like engagement when it comes to news organization has evolved a lot since digital platforms came along. And that idea of having a big board in the newsroom to say which ones are getting, which stories are getting more engaged or not, even that is a little passe nowadays, because there was an initial rush for the numbers. Let's get a lot of reach, and this will be translated into engagement, right? And that idea has evolved to, hey, maybe that story didn't have the reach that we were thinking that it would have, but it had a very qualitative reach, meaning it reached the right people and the right people were talking about it. And the right people are often not necessarily people who have power to change things, but are communities that are concerned about that topic. So when we talk about engagement nowadays in journalism, we are talking about a much more qualified understanding of the variety of things that people do with the news information that we give it to them, right? Now, it's very easy for us to turn engagement into specific metrics like, oh, we get 20,000 comments on our story, therefore it got a lot of engagement, right? But I think a harder and more interesting task is saying, what is the quality of engagement in terms of, did this story help people in any way? Are people meaningfully talking about that story? Did they learn things about this story? Are they pressuring their local governments or their national governments to do something because of this story? So these are things that are a little bit harder to put into metrics, but are, I think, more rewarding in terms of engagement metrics. Now, what creates engagement? Again, that's another a very important question, right? Like, how can we create more engagement? We can think about it by framing, right? Like, we can frame our stories in a way that people will want to talk about them, or we can just do meaningful, impactful stories and explain to people why should they care about it, right? When we talk about those things about quality of news and news that people talk about, we often use the analogy of French fries versus broccoli, right? Like we want people to eat their broccoli, but they want to eat their French fries. And I think it's a useful dichotomy to think about, but it's not really useful in terms of I think it kind of diminishes the intelligence of our audience in a bit, right? Like maybe they do want broccoli, but they want it made in a tasty way, right? Like in other words, maybe they would read the boring school board meeting story if we explain to our audiences the actual values of that story, right? Like why should we care about that sort of thing, right? So I think engagement and overall virality or reach of stories is dependent on the topic. Sure, there are topics that are naturally more interesting to a wider swath of people, but they also go through the way that we tell those stories. Right? Now, the second question is about search engines and their relationship with local news. How can we incentivize local news search engines to help out with local news? Interestingly enough, in this class, again, I'm pitching my class, so tell your students, and if you're students, please register for that class, because the more the merrier, and the more variety the merrier. We have a problems and solutions game. It's an exercise that I do in class, which basically like lists a bunch of goals that we might have in the information ecosystem. And one of the goals is to help out local news. Another goal is to, fight misinformation. Another goal is to make sure diverse information is published online, et cetera, et cetera. And I give them 3 frameworks to solve that goal, to reach that goal. And the frameworks are regulation, public pressure, and market solutions. Just leave it to the market, right? And we talk about those 3 frameworks, and we talk about the pros and cons of each framework. And the students discuss and propose, like, okay, for this goal, this framework would be better. This would be better, et cetera, right? And my non-answer is that nobody can really agree on the right frameworks for each of those goals. And I think it's up to each individual community to see what are the ways to make these big tech companies do the things that we think they should be doing. Because in reality, each community thinks one thing should be done differently than the other in terms of information quality. I come from Brazil, which is a country that has a very different interpretation than the United States about even what freedom of speech is, right? The United States has a very liberal view of what freedom of speech is, which is more libertarian than any other possibly in the world, right? So the United States considers some things to be free speech that the rest of the world doesn't, right? So we have to think about those differences as well. That's just one example in which different jurisdictions and different communities might have different interpretations of what good information is. So is it the role of search engines to fight racism? Well, I think it should be, right? But I don't know if Americans agree with me, right? So with that difference, then comes the next step of how to make it that search engines can do the good thing, right? Well, we can try to regulate them and try to force them into giving more money for local news, to go back to your question, or we could have public pressure to have them give more money to local news, like doing more distribution of funding. But maybe we can pressure them instead of just giving direct money, like some regulators are trying in some jurisdictions, like California and Australia and Canada. They're trying to get big tech to pay more to news organizations, period, not necessarily local news. Maybe what we can do is ask Google to have a local news tab in all the search results, or an info box. What is local news talking about here? Now, Google says it favors local news. It's part of the values that they list somewhere. But I don't think that is as visible. Like, research has shown that they could do more, basically. And I think a lot of it is that baseline of a quality website, right? Like, a lot of local news organizations are one-person operations. Like, how does a person that has to go to the council meeting, has to call the mayor for more information? How is that person even managing to get their website updated with their stories, let alone making sure that website is SEO compliant and have photos and stuff in a quality that is good enough for Google to pick it up? And I saw one of the questions about news deserts. Even like that's in some cases the best case, that we have a one-person operation as a local news organization somewhere, right? Because in a lot of places there isn't even that, right? So now we have to think about the industry as a whole, and how we have failed that community because our capitalistic framework did not solve that demand of information, right? That goes beyond the conversation of even news media and search engines. That is like a whole societal conversation that we should be having. I get very passionate and long-winded about such things, as you can.
God, Daniel, I do have, I want to mention to the group, first of all, that for people who are wondering about content, that this talk is recorded, so it'll be on the Search Mastery Interest Group website probably in less than a week. So that information.
And I can share the link to the slides as well. I think
you can share the slides. That's good, because we can link them to our website too.
I'm going to paste here in the chat, but then we can link it to the website.
Oh, you're going to put in the chat. Oh, okay, awesome. All right. And then we had some comments from a librarian, and you've addressed, I think, some of the questions and comments that were in this chat entry. But the question that is being asked that I think you haven't quite covered yet is, how do you think about the role of news influencers versus journalists in the new media landscape?
I am less of a curmudgeon about them than a lot of my colleagues, I think. I think, let's flip that around, right? Like, if people are going to influencers for any type of information or commentary or something, is because audiences want that, right? Audiences make these people successful because they provide something that they want. And maybe it's because they're commenting on news in a more personable and approachable way than the news organizations have been able to, right? So that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is that they often do a bad job. And the badness of that job relates to putting things out of context, putting things into context that they think is accurate, which is often not, right? We talk a lot about misinformation in our field, and misinformation is not just about inventing facts and changing facts. It's about taking actual facts and connecting them through a misleading contextualization. And I think a lot of influencers do that because they're not really interested in the absence of commentary like most news organizations and news providers are. We in the news industry, again, a 20th century value, just the facts, man, right? Like, we just give the facts and let the audience decide what those facts mean. Which is a little bit deceptive, because even by selecting which facts we give to people, we're kind of telling that those facts are important, right? So I think maybe what we in the news media have to consider is that maybe we need to talk to our audiences the way that they want us to talk to them, which doesn't mean tell them what they want to hear, but tell them things that they should hear in the way that they can receive it, right? Let's have a more frank discussion. Let's have our reporters in social media talking frankly about things, right? Like, let's build on the human aspect of the stories that we write. Let's talk about how our reporters get to the facts that they get to. Let's talk about the way that reporters fail to get to the fact that they want to, right? Because that's a lot of the unwritten things in news media, right? Like, oh, we were trying to get to that story, but like we didn't get enough facts to confirm it, right? So let's be open about that, right?
I think that's it's a really appropriate way to wrap up. We're right at time, so I wish we had another half an hour to go, but unfortunately it's the end of the hour. So first of all, I want to thank you, Daniel, for a fantastic talk, and thank you for the participants for the really good questions. I just want to mention that next month, we will have, next month, we'll have our last talk for this calendar year and this semester. And it's going to be Beth St. Jean, who's going to will take a step back into the big picture of information literacy. It'll be a nice follow-up to this one, and we'll be talking about the roles of public libraries in supporting their communities' needs for information and beyond during the 1918 influenza and COVID-19 pandemics, and so we can look forward to that. That will be on April 16th, the same time. So thanks again, Daniel. I really appreciate your participation in this, and thanks everybody. We hope to see you next month.